The next speaker is Mr. David Douglas, research wildlife biologist at the Alaska Science Center Biology Office of the U.S. Geological Survey. He's going to talk to us on responses of Arctic marine mammals to changing sea ice conditions.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, John, for inviting me back here to speak again. And thank you for all attending and those online as well. The topic I'm speaking on is worthy of a symposium in and of itself, so I'm just going to touch on some highlights, and one way to get there and focus down, I'm just going to be speaking about the Western Arctic Chukchi-Beaufort Sea. I'm going to be focusing primarily on polar bears and walruses, those topics that I know the most about, but some slides at the end about some whale research. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey. Maybe to answer a question right off is maybe many of you might be wondering why someone from the U.S. Geological Survey is here speaking about polar bears and walruses. But the short answer might be that polar bears and walruses are trust species of the Department of Interior, for which some of you may say, what the jargon does that mean? Trust species is a kind of a federal term with a legal basis. It broadly describes things like migratory birds, transboundary fish, endangered and threatened species, species of concern, and because of their protection under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, all marine mammals are trust species. And the Department of Interior is assigned the responsibilities for conservation and management of polar bears, walruses, sea otters, manatees, and dugongs. And all the rest of the marine mammals, whales, seals, the like, sea lions, NOAA has that responsibility, and specifically I think it's down to their National Marine Fisheries Group that takes on that responsibility. And in the Department of Interior, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that kind of has that management oversight. Well, the USGS is a science agency. In our ecosystems mission area, we take our DOI sister agencies as some of our primary clients, and so we provide science to help inform the decision making and things that follow their mandates to follow for those species. So that's the long answers to why I'm at the Alaska Science Center where we've worked. We've had these programs on walruses and polar bears for literally decades. They started back in the 1980s. We have career scientists, early career scientists, real dedicated teams. I'm privileged to be here and presenting a lot of their work on their behalf. A lot of other entities here in the Arctic that work on marine animals, mammals, specifically the NOAA fisheries that I mentioned and their mandates, but also wildlife professionals with the North Slope Borough of Alaska, the state of Alaska, University of Alaska, the Polar Science Center at University of Washington, some Canadian groups, their Fisheries and Oceans and their Environment and Natural Resource Service. And one more that should be up here is the Russians, the Academy of Science and various ministries. Close working relationships with the Russians for decades. Martin Jeffries mentioned, coined something for me, the science ambassador, it's just intrinsic to the science of wildlife in the Arctic. These species are transboundary, and it's been just, well, it's just part of the research, is coordination with the Canadians and Russians. So to dive in here, the programs on polar bears and walrus, a mainstay of the data is tracking. And our tracking programs date back into the 80s and the 90s, so we have a nice baseline of information on which to assess changes and responses to the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. Polar bears wear collars. They're captured and anesthetized by helicopter capture. Only females wear collars because their heads are bigger than their necks and the collars don't slip off. So all the data I'll be showing you are from adult females. The walruses, the best breakthrough in attachment comes from a crossbow. It's very efficient. Lots of animals can be tagged. They're kind of like hockey pucks with barbs, and they stay on for a few months, but we've been able to tag throughout the year or get a lot of seasonal data. I'll be showing you some of those data. Well, literally hundreds of individuals and hundreds of thousands of locations over the decades. And this is one audience that I don't need to describe the diminishing sea ice. But when we overlay, say, some early years from the 80s and more recent years, we see these areas that maybe you all have a different, when you see maps like that overlaid, you may be thinking different things, or it strikes you. I see a loss of habitat. Others probably see shipping lanes and things like that. But clearly a loss of, I see a loss of habitat, and it's sort of expressed here by looking at polar bear locations from the 1980s, late 80s and early 90s. And all those red dots are polar bear locations from that period. And then it's also combined here with a National Ice Center marginal ice zone chart from late September 2008, just to give a context of all this area that polar bears were using in the past. And all those locations that are offshore, we know they were on sea ice because the collars weren't able to give us locations if the bear was in the water. So all of that, are bears on ice in the past that now are doing something different. So their response to the diminishing sea ice is kind of obviated here, that they're somewhere else. And they have a choice here, do they go north with the sea ice and try to follow the retreating pack, or do they come to land? And the answer is, well, they're doing both. The majority are still trying to stay with the sea ice, but we're seeing more bears coming to land and spending longer periods on land, and I'll show you some data for that. Well, let's look at some case examples because it's real interesting. Here's a track of one female in 2008, and she's following the sea ice. She's going to follow the sea ice. So the black tracking down at the bottom, that's during the spring. She comes out of a den. She's working and hunting the ice that is there in the spring. It's over the shelf. That's where they like to hunt seals, sort of preferred. But as the ice begins to retreat, and I mark her track there in red, and she starts making a concerted effort going north, and she makes that, tremendous journey, peaking out of the very top there in the most northernmost on September 26th. That's the inset chart there with another NIC chart showing she has stayed with the main pack pretty much. Definitely a dedicated effort to get up there. And then a little bit of stats here to boast what she has done: 115 days, over 3,600 kilometers. That averages over 30 kilometers a day on average, and was, I find, quite remarkable. She did that with a cub of the year that we know survived. So quite a journey, and this is not totally cherry-picked. There are other examples of where bears are making these, remarkable trips north following the pack ice. Other bears that may procrastinate that decision as to which way to go find themselves on these vast areas of ice melting out from under them. Again, this is a view of 2008. These red dots here are all polar bear locations associated with late August. The bear we just followed is one of these ones in the north trying to make it with the pack ice. But off the northwest coast of Alaska here, there's a lot of bears that are on that ice, and all that ice eventually melts, and all those bears, took a swim at some point. Some swam to land, some went north, some we never heard from again. So there's a lot of swimming involved now, more than there was. And so I want to show you a record of what to date is still the longest distance swim that we've seen a polar bear make. This is published by George Sterner back in 2011, and it was in 2008. And surprisingly, this bear went from land and tried to make it back to sea ice, and she did. It took her, that portion in red there is a 9-day consecutive, she never got out, swim, tremendous distance. And then after she gets out, she's working through the marginal ice and makes another 1,400 kilometers before she returns back, and we captured her again there. And so it was able to be documented that she lost 22% of her weight during that journey, and she lost her cub that she had with her at the beginning of the season. So that's a record swim. And then there's also a paper by Anthony Pagano, who went through all of the data and extracted long-distance swimming, which he defined as greater than 50 kilometers, and sort of looked at all the conditions that these swims are taking place. Most of the swims are for bears going from the unconsolidated pack, swimming north, trying to get to more consolidated ice. The majority of swims are like that. But we see bears swimming from the pack to the land, and that's an example here. Several days, again, 5 days, I think, in this particular swim. So there's a paper that kind of describes all these. Here's the second most common swim, was from land to land. Bears that do come to land often will swim, rather than walking along the coast. If they want to get somewhere, they'll cut the corner and just swim across, kind of these near shore swims. So there's more bears coming to land, mentioned that, and they're spending more time when they're on the land. And that's what the line chart here is showing, the early on, bears may be spending a couple of weeks on average on land. Now it's a couple of months. So longer stents on land. And then down here on the bottom, this text is some papers by our principal project leader in polar bears, Todd Atwood, studied the bears in the southern Beaufort Sea, basically finding that in the past, maybe 6% of the bear population was coming ashore. Now it's closer to what, 20%. And Karen Rode published a similar paper for the Chukchi Sea, a little bit definition, but also seeing a doubling of the number of bears that come to land in the summer. So with more bears on land, here's a paper by Jim Wilder, Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, who went back and went through all the records back into the 1800s, finding every record he could of a polar bear attack. More bears on land, people, are there more attacks? And he documents all the different kinds of attacks, 20 of which have led to fatalities. So overall, in the broad scheme of things, they're pretty rare compared to, say, brown bears or black bears, but it is, low density of people and pretty remote. But one thing they do point out here, when he looked at how many of these attacks per year, per decade, and plots that out, the regression was not significant, but he does point out in the paper here that this is only based, these 15 attacks in the last decade here is only 5 years. It's just 2010 through 2014. So maybe there is, you might expect with a greater prevalence of bears on land, more people going to the Arctic, the potential is there. With more bears on land, is there a tendency for more crossbreeding with brown bears, which, and this is a study out of Canada in the far eastern Beaufort Sea there, that's Banks Island, a new paper that's very thorough, and they found among 25 brown bears, they find an increasing frequency of brown bears in the coastal areas. And then they looked at their genetics, and 8 of them had polar bear genetics, signatures in their DNA. So at face value, it sounds like, wow, that's quite a bit of crossbreeding. But their very detailed analysis was able to trace back the 4 crosses and then the 4 back crosses all started with one female polar bear who bred with 2 brown bears at different times. So it all traced back to sort of a single individual female polar bear to begin with. And then they also point out that the crossbreeding was crossing back into the brown bears, not polar bears. And despite the greater prevalence of polar bears in the region, they say until such time that they see back crossing into the polar bear population, what they've seen here in this paper, the polar bear genetic line stays clean, the back crossings to the brown bears in this study, in this example. And here's a paper that was done by Karen Rode, this getting a lot of attention because it compares the subpopulation of polar bears in the Chukchi Sea with those in the Beaufort Sea. And it's very clear that the bears in the Beaufort Sea, when you look at things like their body condition indices and their reproductive indices, their weights, and even their population numbers, in the Beaufort Sea, the red flags are up and the population looks like it's declining somewhat. But in the Chukchi Sea, the bears are very healthy, right? Adjacent, healthy bears, great condition, good reproductive indices. The conclusion, is the speculation is that the Chukchi Sea, despite its loss, there's still, it's such a huge, vast shelf area that the sea ice persists over the shelf for a lot longer than it does in this area where it quickly retreats out over to the less productive deep waters. And that the Chukchi Sea, by and large, is just a more productive ecosystem with the currents and that there's more seals and more prey for them. I have here the point of view from a polar bear. Our scientist Anthony Pagano, who's doing his PhD, is studying accelerometers, which are three-dimensional activity sensors that can be attached to the polar bear collars or things like that. And he's trying to discern what kinds of behavioral activities can be inferred from the data from a three-dimensional accelerometer. So he has put these on collars on bears in zoos with cooperation with zoos and videotape them, and can you tell resting, obviously, from say walking and swimming? And the holy grail, can you detect feeding events from accelerometer data? So clearly feeding in a zoo would be different than in out in the wild. So he's put on these video collars onto free-ranging polar bears, and they go out for, say, a week, and then he captures them again and gets the data back, and I'm going to show you some highlights just briefly here if this will work. So you're looking at the chin of a polar bear here who's going to make a lunge at a seal right there. Saw a seal, maybe poke its head up at the edge of that flow, and just like that, she's got it in his jaws. She's got a ring seal. She's going to process that seal. She's going to go right after that rich, fatty blubber that you'll see her eating here now. We're jumping. These are just clips. And the next clip is coming. She's going to be swimming under the water, come out onto the ice floe just like that and charge what looks to me to be a bearded seal. Here she is under the water. She's out. She's charging. There's the bearded seal. Boom. She's not successful there, but she gave it a try. Bearded seals are big. And we know that male polar bears are more successful taking the bearded seals, but she gave it a great try there. Because you like that, let's see, one more. I could watch this stuff all day. Here, this is a different individual. She's scraping at like a seal breathe hole, probably detecting that this is active. She's in a still hunt now. She's detected something, maybe coming up, and she lunges to break the ice and go for the seal. She doesn't get it. She's not successful on this hunt. This is a day later in the afternoon. It's a cold, foggy, frosty day, minus 12 C today. Here she is the next day, afternoon, sunny. She has caught a seal. So she did get a seal this day. That's a ring seal. And here she is the next day. Next afternoon, she's being courted by a male suitor. It's the breeding period.
This is a PG.
Yeah, this clip is. But anyway, that's interesting.
Yeah, David, quick question. Let me interrupt you. Yeah, walruses. That's exactly what I was going to ask you. Are you going to talk a little bit about walruses?
A little bit right now.
Yeah, but we're really short on time, so.
Okay, very quick. Walruses, they respond to the diminished ice. When it retreats off the shore, they come ashore. They don't follow the pack ice out over the deep water where they can't stay or feed effectively. So they come ashore, particularly Point Lay in those years is an area of big haul-outs. Sensors on their transmitters tell us when they're swimming, when they're hauled out, and can detect when they're in the water but they're not feeding. And when they feed, and when they're feeding from point sources on land, they spend more time in the water not feeding, i.e. they're commuting to places to feed. They're not on an ice floe where the cafeteria is right below them, where they spend less time in the water but not foraging. We can take this kind of information and help build it into models using all, step by step from how might the sea ice be in the future to what might that mean to their energetics, to what that might mean ultimately to their reproductive success. These models are helping inform the Fish and Wildlife Service, who needs to make a decision about the Endangered Species Act petition on walrus. They'll be making that decision this year. Real quickly, some bowhead whale research that shows these use areas. Where they go in the spring, the fall, and the winter is all tied to the biological oceanography, where the copepods are blooming, where the krill are aggregating, the whales are following them around. Great paper by John Sitta, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and lots of collaborators in that study. Whales harvested. This is from whale harvest at Barrow. These are immature in the fall takes. There's over 100 whales in this analysis, and an index of body condition shows that these whales are just in better condition in the fall over the past few decades. The authors of this paper, Craig George from the North Slope Borough, they postulate that the more open ocean, more primary productivity, more copepods and krill and things to feed on. Also the winds causing upwellings, just an overall productivity is better. And the populations are thought to be increasing. And last, beluga whales. Some studies here of different stocks and where they are in the summer. Their population stable, possibly increasing as well. And finally, I just wanted to close on something that the senator said at the very beginning, that good decisions need data. And there's a lot of decisions to come in the Arctic and They'll involve environmental stewardship and, thinking about community and everything else, and the data and the science to inform those decisions will make for better decisions. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Actually, we could continue listening to you all the way to lunch, but I'm sure Amy and Alexei would not like that. Still, there are a couple of questions that maybe you can quickly address.
I'll try, yeah.
One of them has to do with that gender bias in your observations. Is there any way to actually tag the male polar bears? I think they're also important in the overall scheme.
Yeah, there's been some, yes, we have tagged, but not with collars. The first thing we tried were some implants, subcutaneous implants between their shoulder blades. Not tremendously successful. We think that the body pushed them out. We've tried ear tags, but big males will often pull those out. Probably our most successful is a glue-on the back, like they do with seals. Just actually glued to the fur. They only stay on a few months, though. But we do it. We are trying to fill in. There's not a great deal of sexual difference between how male and female polar bears move around. There's a tremendous segregation in the walrus. The males pretty much stay in the Bering Sea all summer. It's the females and their young and the immatures that go to the Chukchi Sea. But polar bears is not as obvious as that if there are differences in.
I think one of the points of the person that posed the question had to do with attacks, or males being more prone to do the attacks on humans than female. Is that correct or not?
Well, the study by Jim Wilder said that most of the attacks that he studied the accounts of were from nutritionally stressed males. Right. Attacks by females were usually in defense of cubs and much less common.
But attacks in terms of bears to humans, would it be mostly done by males or females? Males?
Mostly done by males.
Okay, so that
nutritionally stressed males that are on land.
I see. Gotcha. I'm sorry. So finally, and again, I think this is an important question, and I'm sure Amy won't mind if I take a few minutes. Are you working with the U.S. Coast Guard and Canadian Coast Guard, for that matter, to create real-time geofencing for maritime activities and/or generate warnings for communities and recreational users of the Arctic? So are you working with the Coast Guard?
No. For geofencing?
Yes.
Based on animal movements?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
I can maybe see the idea behind that, but I don't think we have a large enough sample of animals tagged at any one time to think that we would have a geofencing kind of strategy. Oh. I think if we accumulated data, and they're doing that with the walrus, with all the shipping lanes, they're trying to look at the historical intersection of the ships and the walrus movements to see what kind of interactions, if they can detect any responses to past events in the data. But we usually don't have that large a sample of animals tagged at any one time.
Well, thanks. We have more questions, and people would like to see more movies, but we just don't have time. Thank you.